How do we encourage the public to consider the complexities of history? And how do we make sure they can use this to make sense of the world around them?
Well, I can say civics. I think, that the amplifier of this is the biggest thing in history is people's way of grappling with things that they don't feel they can turn to history to better understand. That these things are new. We've had presidents that are unlike other presidents. We've had, the pandemic, which was unlike this other pandemic, at least for we weren't alive for the one in the 20th century. But when history education is focused on memorizing facts, memorizing that trivia, it makes it really difficult to find parallels, to find lessons, to find ways to transfer that knowledge to real world circumstances. And that's why I emphasize civics. I by the way, was not a political science person. I studied history, was a history teacher, and loved trivia. But what I realized with some of these huge events that I myself didn't really know how to grapple with, it really came back to how do we find those civic lessons in the past to better understand the present? And then how does history surface these civic lessons? What does history from 200 years ago tell us about democracy building today? When we talk about fairness in current circumstances, how do rights movements of 50, 100, 150 years ago, what lessons can we draw from that? And the answer is, if the answer is, you don't know or you can't, I'm saying you're not looking hard enough. I make this joke, I did teacher education at the University of Kentucky, and when you work in social studies education, there's a lot of people who love history. So I would take their favorite topic, the Roman Empire, and I'd say, well, what does that have to do with today? Well, it impacts us today. Well, how? Well, it impacts us today. Well, how? But it impacts us today. And ultimately, I would say it is not important if you can't tell me why it's important. And that's not because I don't think it's important, but because we need to get out of this space where we're not demonstrating to young people and adults why that's important and how they apply that learning to the real world. An educator over there.
Not to throw our other panelists or anybody else, if you have a comment too, to add to it. If you have additionals to add to this, I'm going to ask maybe, so how because we've talked a little bit about how this might come out in the classroom. How might this find a way into the public history realm? Solutions on helping the public grapple with this.
I would say, I would hope that there's ways to use those kinds of statements which have become commonplace, right? And I think they're basically part of the 24/7 news cycle and hyping events that otherwise may not be getting as much attention as broadcasters would want. But I hope there's opportunities to say, history actually requires some distance, right? Some things are important, and you can sense that immediately, but in terms of weighing the relative importance and influence in what meaning you can draw from them in any given moment, that requires some temporal distance. It requires the ability to sort of survey a period and not be caught up in the moments. There's nothing in critical race theory that I wasn't teaching 50 years ago, right? We've known about racism for a long time. We've known about lynching. We've known about, what happened during Reconstruction, black voting, and then the loss thereof through fraud and violence and everything else. So, we're a democracy. If you want to trace our lineage back to ancient Greece and Rome and buy into the idea that open and free discussion is where societies can make the best choices and people can vote and choose representatives that best respond to their interests, we've got to be able to explore any topic that we need to. And the idea that the legislature should be policing what's taught in the schools, I think is really problematic. History is always political, but it's become politicized in ways recently that I think are troubling and not all that promising.
And to kind of piggyback on that a little bit is, I think one of the things for us as a public history organization, though, and part of our goal is how do we provide this public access to things? And I think another challenge that we face, and then again, as you hear us in our reporting back to you all, is there is more than enough Kentucky history to go around. I think our challenge is how do we pace ourselves so that we're not trying to satisfy everybody, right? So how do you bring this in, because it muddies the water, it creates these divisions. You're preferencing this one over that one, kind of a thing. So how do we also encourage our community historical societies or historical organizations to not necessarily what content delivery are they doing, but how do these engagement strategies with the communities that they're serving? I think it's the part that really kind of gets to me to that area, because it's that area I think that we live in that then also helps us catapult over to helping the classroom teachers develop those materials and things. So it's a little bit about process more than it is about content for us, or I think at least the things that history places work in. For those of you that don't know me, those of you who know me for 5 minutes know that my past came from the Science Museum realm, where inquiry education was the day. I would argue that history was the original inquiry education. We all started off with, what's that burning question I want to know more about? And then what's the process I go through to uncover that? And so I think that the idea that history is not an inquiry activity, no, it is. At its basis, it's an inquiry thing. How do we teach students to go through that process? How do they satisfy that initial inquiry, that initial burning question that they're trying to do in a way that gives them accuracy, right? It's not the scientific method kind of thing, but what is that thing that allows them to know how to question bias in the readings that they're doing, how to look at contextual elements and things like that. So I find it fascinating. I could go on and on. I should stop. Any other questions that you all wanted to toss out to the panel? Yes, Mark.
Daniel, since you raised it, and Carly, something that you said earlier, so my question relates to a couple of things you all said. One, when you were speaking one-on-one with a student who said, no matter what evidence you give me, you will not persuade me. If you extrapolate that into the political dialogue right now, we have a problem. And actually, I think my question is to ask the panel for advice. How do we answer that in the political space? The legislature has a reading list for history classes. I don't know of anything on the reading list that shouldn't be considered certainly you should approach it with an inquiry-based method and contact and so forth. But the General Assembly, to my knowledge, has never passed a bill that says, here's what we teach in calculus class, or here's what we teach in biology class. This is an extraordinary moment. I know, Scott, you advise us not to say it's a historic moment, but it's extraordinary. They passed the Kentucky Education Reform Act in 1990 that the principle of which is, here are the standards, and we're not going to tell you how to meet them, but we are going to test to see whether you meet them. Here we are in 2022 with the legislature writing in the law what will be taught in a classroom. That's a pretty extraordinary change, but I dare not say it's towards.
You can say it, just don't say it every other time.
I wonder if the panel has any advice about how this association and we as citizens can effectively respond to this, because it's not good.
So when standards were being proposed, I went to Frankfurt several times to advocate for them. And the critics of them listed all the things that the standards didn't contain, all the names that weren't contained. And when I went up and spoke, I said, the science standards say students need to learn about the chemical composition of water, but I don't see hydrogen or oxygen mentioned once in this whole document. How are students supposed to learn about that? And ultimately it was about getting at that process piece. They passed not because of me, but because of a lot of grassroots work. And that's really where I think it comes down to, is the people in conversation who are going to say no evidence is going to convince me. You shouldn't waste your breath in those individual circumstances. But I do think we're at a moment where it's valuable to continue to lean into that evidence that we do have and have that be an expectation. It's in building that support for that across different organizations and people who, you know, suspend their critical mindsets in times that are advantageous to them, is how do we bring it back to the evidence upon which we want to base our decisions.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you were speaking with legislative leaders and in the revisions and in the crafting of the bill, correct?
Including the one who added that list of books. And I said, we don't need those. I taught every single one of those with a few exceptions. And I'm worried that we're just going to keep adding to that list. And his response was, well, we need to trust that future legislators won't do that. But that's the thing, is even in those conversations with people across the different aisles, we all agree on several things. But what they actually look like in practice is where it gets disjointed. And I think continuing to push people and have them speak to what they say they believe, it's not fun. It's not fun being an advocate.
And that's, so let me turn to that area too, because you know, as part of what this is, the group that we have here are advocates for Kentucky history.
And I think the more you can get people excited to realize, you know, history really is interesting, and Kentucky has fabulous stories of all kinds of people, from every race, from every walk of life, every orientation, all of that. And, you know, if you can get people interested in that, then they'll come to the old Capitol building and won't walk out when they walk in and say, oh, it's a history thing, and they walk out, you know, we were talking about earlier. And they'll come to your program and want to be a part and learn more. I mean, I went to see Hamilton for another time at the Aeronaut in Cincinnati in September. And I was just amazed sitting there. You know, here I am, I teach about Alexander Hamilton all the time. And all around me are these people who didn't know who he was at all. And they were going, did that really happen? Was that really true? You know, and all of this. And I just wanted to say, yes, history is awesome, you know, and tell them this. And they were, and I know some of them, I watched at the intermission, they got their phones out and they were looking up Alexander. Well, that really did happen, you know, that kind of thing. And so if you share that energy, then people want to get involved and they want to preserve Kentucky's history. They want to get those stories out there. So I would just say there's going to be the people that you're never going to convince. But like you said, you say I'll walk away from now. But there's going to be those that you win over, and they're going to love their state's history. And like I said, Kentucky has one of the richest state's history there is, and I just wish more people knew it. So just keep at it. I just encourage you to talk to people, to educate people, and share your passion. You obviously have a passion for Kentucky history, or you would not be a part of this group. So please share that passion, and it'll bring more people in.
I think I think we're in a space right now where community organizing is a bigger part of history and just education more generally than I think we've thought about in the recent past. That Kentucky has rich history, it has rich civic organizations, but it doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure connecting all of them that some sources do with more resources. I was recently at the Reagan Library talking about all that we're doing in Kentucky, and they go, oh, how many people do you have on staff? I go, oh no, I do this in my free time. And I'm the one doing it in my free time with other people in our free time. And people are amazed with what we're doing in Kentucky with very little. So this is a big moment to think about how we lean into those kind of advocacy structures. And then the other piece of this is the education piece. K-12 advocate until the day I die. And what I've seen a lot from the academy, sorry, but from other people is telling teachers what they should be doing instead of listening to them. There's a strong deprofessionalization of education. You all have seen it. It's been pretty bad in Kentucky in a number of ways, but also nationally. So to build those more reciprocal relationships with educators and listen to them, listen to how they say they want to advocate for the students and what they need, versus saying, here is what you need. I think that would be a huge game changer in education.